Hi guys, this is Nia and I'm back with another video. Today I will be showing you my way of painting peonies. This is probably the most requested tutorial that I've been asked for, and I've been putting it aside for a while because it is quite difficult to break down the layers, and there are so many ways to paint this because there are a few types of peonies. So today I will just show you my first version, and I might come up with more types in the future. So I'm going to begin first by drawing it out as usual, and I'm going to try to break down the layers. It's really not the easiest thing to paint if you're new to watercolors because it does require you to visualize in your mind how the layers would be constructed around the center. I basically like to start off by drawing it out from the middle, and I try to first draw out a bulb shape, and I draw the petals within the bulb for the center, so it looks like the center of the flower petals are closed off. Then I build around it little by little, and I try to add layers of the petals in between of the previous one so they don't look like they're stacked up against each other. While doing this, I'm also thinking about the roundness of the flower, and as I progress to the outer layer, I also start to bloom out the petals so it looks like the flower is opening from the outside while the center is still closed. It gets a bit easier if you're painting the flower facing the top because you can draw out more even round petals, so it's a bit more straightforward instead of thinking about the overlay of every single layer and how certain parts or certain angles of the flower will look like. So if you're new, I would suggest for you to do just a top view of each of the flower instead of doing a side view where you have to think about the blooming petals. If you want to shift the angle whilst drawing a top view, you can also do that by shifting the center slightly. So like the one that I just drew out here, since I want the flower to be facing the right, the center is also closer to the right and the petals look thinner and more dense toward the right side, whilst the petals on the left side are looking a bit wider because the inner part of the petals on the left side are a bit more exposed. And this would also apply if your flower is facing slightly to the left side. The center will shift closer to the left side and you will have more space for wider petals on the right side of your flower. Next, I'm going to show you how I will paint it later on. As we paint, we won't be painting the outlines like we drew it out before, but we're going to be painting the shapes as individual petals. So a good way to try to visualize how the petals will look like is by drawing it out as individual shapes. I'm also going to leave a tiny bit of space in between each shape because I don't really want too many petals touching each other when I paint later on because that will make the painting look too bulky. After I paint most of the petals later, I will go over some of the empty spaces that I've left out to use a darker color and place down some shadows. I'm just drawing it out roughly here, but this is how my thinking process is when I paint these flowers. It's also okay to build on the petals after you've painted the shadows if you want to adjust the shape further or make sure that the rough silhouette of the flower is still round. Draw a few more of these until you're comfortable. It's okay to draw out as many as you want if you're still uncomfortable with visualizing it, because learning to visualize the shapes will make your painting process much enjoyable and less stressful later on if you're still trying to get to know the medium too. To finish the flower off, I like to add some lines with dots on top to create the pollen at the center. And we can either paint this with a darker color or a lighter color, but I find that adding this element makes the painting look more interesting. For the leaf, I'm going to be drawing and painting it very loosely. I'm just going to do basic leaf shape with rough curvy lines for the sides of the leaf, and I'm also going to add some smaller leaves with thin delicate stems as additional elements and fillers to the final painting. I'm going to go over the colors now. So the main color that I'm going to be using for the peonies is this slightly dusty pink color, which I mixed myself, and I will go over the colors that I used to create the color if you're interested, or you can use your own pink mixture that you already have. I'm also going to use additional colors just to slightly vary the tone of pink so all the flowers doesn't look exactly the same, and also a darker color for shadows. And these additional colors are Quin Red, Permanent Yellow Deep, and also Crimson Lake. I made this pink color a while ago because I wanted to create more of a dusty or antique looking colors, and here is the mix if you're interested. The color is made out of white, Quin Opera, Gray of Gray, Ultramarine Deep, and also Jaune Brilliant. So to make these colors, I just basically squeeze these colors in a half can, just like how I filled my Holbein paints. Then I mix it up with a needle and I just adjust the colors by adding more of certain colors to get the right tone of pink that I had in mind. And then for the leaf and the stem, I'm going to use the colors Olive Green, Hansa Yellow, and Ultramarine Violet. I'm going to paint the flowers now, so for the first one I'm going to just start with the pink mixture that I already have, and I'm going to paint this first one in the middle facing the top, and like how I've drawn it out before, I'm going to start by painting it from the middle, making sure that the center bulb is nice and round to help me keep the round volume of the peony as I wrap more petals around it. While doing this, I am also leaving out the white space in between the petals so it doesn't look like a giant silhouette instead, and I'm placing the petals in between each other as I build it up so none of the negative space creates a straight line from the alignment to keep it natural and organic. At the moment, this flower is looking a bit empty, so I'm going to build up the volume and the shadow by adding a darker tone of pink, and to do this I'm going to add a bit of Quin Red to my pink color, and I'm going to use this to paint in between the petals to create the separation. I'm just going to paint this very loosely. Just make sure that you don't overdo this because again it might make the flower look too bulky, so try to not overwork a certain area even if you keep feeling like it needs adjustments, because if you adjust too much you might end up coloring the whole petal with a dark pink color instead. So don't worry, because we're still going to build on with darker pink later on if you feel like certain areas need more definition. When you're painting this, it's a good idea to look at the overall picture once in a while and not get too caught up in a certain area, and make sure that the overall silhouette of the flower is round. Sometimes if we focus too much on a certain part, when we look at it again you might have created some angles or rectangle instead of a round shape, and when that happens just make sure you catch it and add more petals to adjust the overall shape. So now I'm going to build on more of the darker shadow, and this time I want to also introduce another tone of pink by adding some Permanent Yellow Deep into the previous mixture, and I'm going to use this thicker consistency paint to get a darker value, and I'm going to apply this in areas where I feel needs a touch more definition, but I'm not going to apply this to all of the shadow area. Instead, I'm making thinner lines to apply in some of the deeper edges, because that would make the previous layer a bit redundant if you go over the whole thing. So make sure you think about the placement and place this darker value color sparingly to deepen certain areas. And once you've placed down the color, it's also a good idea to soften certain parts if you feel like it stands out a bit too much. For the next flower, I'm going to add more pink to the color that I previously used for the shadow, which has the Permanent Yellow Deep, just to turn this pink into a slightly more coral color. And for this flower, I'm going to paint it facing the side. This is a bit different in a way that I'm trying to keep the center round still, but it's not a complete circle, and I'm still also leaving the center empty so I can add the pollen later on. As I build on the petals, I'm also thinking about their placement on the angles, so as we've drawn out before, you'd be able to see more of the open petals on the left hand side, and on the right side where the flower is facing, the petals will look slightly closer to each other. I'm going to add the shadow area again now by adding more Quin Red into the mix. I'm still also going to add a touch of the permanent yellow deep though, just to keep the same coral color. And I'm just going to apply it like how I did before in between the petals, but this time, because the distinction of the open petals are a bit more visible, I'm going to soften the shadow where the petals are opened and leave the other side of the shadow with a sharper edge. And to soften the edge, I'm just going to use a clean dry brush, and I'm going to reactivate some of the paint that's already on the paper and soften one side of the shadow. So now once the edges of the shadows are a bit softer, you'll realize that the color is also turned more light after being spread out. So I'm going to build the next layer using a thicker consistency of the same mixture and apply it like how I did for the first peony. You'll realize that while painting the shadow, I've also created more petals on the top right hand side of the flower compared to what I initially painted as the base petals before, because if you add thin layers slowly, the colors will not be too dark and you can still correct certain placement of petals by making the shadow outline. So say where my petals were a bit too large before, I can separate the large petal into two petals with the shadow color to correct it. So for the third flower, I decided to paint it facing the left, and as you can see, I didn't start with a good base petal. Even the center is looking slightly more rectangular than round, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to correct it using the same method that I used for the previous peony. So here, as you can see, the petals are a bit all over the place, and to correct it, I'm going to treat the shadow color as outlines like how we drew it out before in the beginning. I'm going to use this dark color to correct some of the petal shapes by outlining it more correctly, and from here I can fix the distorted shapes and even the silhouette of the peony. Once I've painted the outline and I'm quite happy with the structure of the peony now, I'm just going to treat it like how I did before by softening some of the edges. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to build up on the shadow color again by introducing a slightly different tone of pink. So once I'm done with the base structure of the flower, I'm going to continue on to paint the center of the flower. And for this, I'm just going to use the permanent yellow deep by itself, and I'm going to paint dots where the flower is facing the top. And where it's facing the side, I also want to paint the pollen or the center of the flower sideways, so I'm going to paint lines instead of just dots here. And I'm also going to incorporate some of the darker red, which is the Crimson Lake, with a bit of the yellow to introduce a little bit of darkness or the shadow. And I'm going to paint some of the lines and also the dots on top. And later on, after this all dries, I'm going to add a lighter color, and this dark red mixed with the yellow will create a nice dark base color for the lighter yellow to pop later on. Using the same mix of Permanent Yellow Deep and Crimson Lake, I'm also going to add some finer shadows to redefine the folds a bit more, but for this I'm only going to paint it in certain areas where I feel like it's a little bit too bulky, and I'm going to use it to break up the shape and make it look lighter in weight. Now I'm finally going to move on to the leaves. The leaves are quite simple. There are only 3 colors, so I'm going to use the olive green as the main green color, Hansa yellow to brighten and warm up the green slightly, and ultramarine violet to darken and deepen the green. I'm going to paint the larger leaves first so it can frame the flowers nicely, and I'm going to first paint a basic leaf shape, then I'm going to add the curves after to make it a bit easier. However, if you're comfortable with painting leaves, you can also paint it straight up. Again, I'm painting this very loosely, just like how I painted the flowers. And as you've probably noticed, I also like to fill in some of the spaces in between the flowers with the green, as if there is a bit of the leaf peeking through the background. And because the pink of the peony are quite light, this will also help define the flower petals. I'm going to introduce the darker tone of green to the leaves now by mixing in the ultramarine violet to the green mixture, and I'm going to apply this by following the direction of the veins of the leaves, but I'm also leaving out some of the base color to peek through certain areas, and in some leaves I'm also going to leave it quite light so there's a slight variation of color. Now I'm going to add the smaller filler leaves in some areas where I feel needs to be filled up, but it's just in a slightly awkward position, so it would be bad or it would turn out bulky if I add more of the larger leaves. And for this I'm going to use my small brush to paint the smaller leaves, just so there's a slight variation in weight. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I also used a little bit of white gouache to mix it with either Hansa Yellow or the Permanent Yellow Deep to create an opaque yellow color that can be placed on top of the darker pollen that I placed down in the previous layer. If you want the dots and lines to pop out a bit more though, you can also just use the white gouache straight up. Lastly, I also added more leaves on the right hand side to give it a pop of color, so I decided to also use a brighter green by adding more Hansa Yellow to the olive green, then finishing it off with a slightly darker green but still in a thin consistency to keep it nice and light. And before I finish off, I always like to look at the overall painting to see if you need to make any small adjustments to the painting, and that's pretty much it. This is my version, or at least one of my versions of peony flowers. I hope you guys enjoyed this one and learned something new, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!